King Henry VIII is one of the most famous rulers in history. Larger than life, both in personality and in stature, he reigned for nearly 4 decades and transformed England forever. His story is one of power, religion, and above all, marriage. 6 marriages to be exact. Each one shaped not only his life, but the future of England. Early life and becoming king. Henry VIII was born in 1491, the second son of Henry VII, the first Tudor king. His older brother, Arthur, was heir to the throne. But in 1502, Arthur died. Suddenly, this left young Henry as the new heir. In 1509, when his father died, the 17-year-old Henry became king. Handsome, athletic, and charming, Henry was seen as the perfect Renaissance prince. One of his first acts as king was to marry his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the powerful King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. First, marriage. Catherine of Aragon. Henry and Catherine's marriage lasted more than 20 years. At first, it was a happy and politically strong union, tying England to Spain. But Henry's greatest concern was producing a male heir. Catherine became pregnant many times, but most of the children were stillborn or died young. Only one child survived, a daughter, Mary Tudor, born in 1516. Henry was affectionate toward Mary, but he was deeply frustrated. He believed England needed a son to secure the Tudor dynasty. By the mid-1520s, Catherine was past childbearing age, and Henry's attention turned elsewhere. The king's great matter, Henry became obsessed with ending his marriage to Catherine. He argued that their union was cursed, since Catherine had once been married to his brother Arthur. He appealed to the Pope for an annulment, but the Pope, pressured by Catherine's nephew, the powerful Emperor Charles V, refused. This crisis became known as the King's Great Matter. Henry's frustration soon turned into a revolution. Anne Boleyn and the break with Rome around 1525, Henry fell in love with Anne Boleyn, one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting. Unlike most women at court, Anne refused to be his mistress. She demanded marriage. Henry became determined to have her. But since the Pope refused an annulment, Henry took drastic action. In 1533, he secretly married Anne Boleyn. Soon after, he broke with the Catholic Church, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England. This marked the start of the English Reformation, one of the most important events in English history. Anne was crowned queen, and in September 1533, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. The future Elizabeth I. Henry was disappointed. He needed a son. Anne suffered several miscarriages, one of which may have been a boy. Henry grew frustrated, and political enemies gathered against her. In 1536, Anne was arrested and accused of adultery, incest, and treason. The charges were likely false, but Henry wanted her gone. On 19th May 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed at the Tower of London. Third wife, Jane Seymour. Just days after Anne's death, Henry married Jane Seymour. Unlike Anne, Jane was quiet, gentle, and obedient. Most importantly, in 1537, she gave Henry the son he longed for, Edward VI. But Jane died shortly after childbirth. Henry was devastated, calling her his true wife. She was buried beside him at Windsor, where he would one day join her. Fourth wife, Anne of Cleves in 1540. Henry agreed to marry Anne of Cleves, a German princess, to form an alliance with Protestant states. But when Henry met her in person, he was horrified, famously calling her a Flanders mare. The marriage was never consummated and was annulled. Within months, surprisingly, Anne accepted her fate gracefully, becoming Henry's beloved sister. She lived comfortably in England until her death. Fifth wife, Catherine Howard. Soon after, Henry married Catherine Howard, a young woman nearly 30 years his junior. At first, Henry was delighted, calling her his rose without a thorn. But within 2 years, Catherine was accused of adultery. Unlike Anne Boleyn, the evidence against her was true. In 1542, Catherine was executed for treason at the Tower of London. Catherine Parr, Henry's final wife, was Catherine Parr, a wise and pious widow. She acted as a nurse to Henry in his declining years and worked hard to reconcile him with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Catherine Parr outlived Henry, becoming the only wife to survive him. Henry's later years, by the 1540s, Henry was a shadow of his former self. Once athletic, he had become obese, plagued with leg ulcers and poor health. But his power was still immense. He had seized the wealth of the monasteries, built up England's navy, and established the crown as supreme over the church. When Henry died in 1547, at the age of 55, he left behind 3 legitimate children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, who would each rule England in turn. Henry VIII was more than just the king with 6 wives. He was a man who reshaped a nation, its religion, its monarchy, and its destiny. His story remains one of the most fascinating chapters in English history. Edward's story is one of power, religion, and tragedy. Let's explore the full life of England's boy king. Early life. Edward was born on 12 October 1537 at Hampton Court Palace. His mother, Jane Seymour, was Henry VIII's 3rd wife, and the only one to give him the son he longed for. But tragedy struck. Jane died just days after Edward's birth. Henry VIII doted on his son, calling him the jewel of the realm. As heir, Edward received the best education possible. He learned Latin, Greek, French, and even a little Italian. He studied history, philosophy, and theology, and he was trained to become a godly Protestant prince. Becoming king, when Henry VIII died in 1547, Edward was only 9 years old. Too young to rule, real power fell to his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who became Lord Protector. Edward was crowned at Westminster Abbey in February 1547. Because of his age, he sat in a special raised coronation chair so that everyone could see the new boy king. At first, people were hopeful. Edward was bright, healthy-looking, and deeply interested in religion. Religion and Reformation. Edward was a devout Protestant, even more so than his father. Under his reign, the English church moved further away from Catholic traditions. The Book of Common Prayer was introduced in English, replacing Latin. Priests were allowed to marry. Catholic Mass was abolished. Church images, relics, and stained glass were destroyed. For Protestants, this was progress. But for Catholics, it was a disaster. Rebellions broke out, including the Prayer Book Rebellion in Devon and Cornwall in 1549, where locals demanded the return of the old Latin Mass. The rebellion was crushed with brutal force, struggles for power. As Edward grew older, he wanted more control. But being a boy king meant his government was often run by ambitious men. First, his uncle Somerset lost power, accused of poor leadership. He was overthrown and later executed. Next, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, rose to power. Northumberland tried to control the young king's council and future. Edward, meanwhile, spent his days reading, writing in his diary, and learning statecraft. He loved studying scripture and dreamed of making England a fully Protestant nation. Edward's health, despite his education and energy, Edward was sickly. He often suffered from fevers, coughs, and weakness. By 1552, it became clear he had tuberculosis. He grew thin, pale, and frail, so weak that he often had to be carried around or sit in a special padded chair during council meetings. But his mind remained sharp. Even as his body weakened, Edward continued to study and write. His diary still survives today, giving us insight into his thoughts. The succession crisis. Edward knew he was dying. At just 15 years old, he faced the question his father had dreaded. Who would rule after him? His half-sister Mary Tudor was next in line. But she was Catholic. Edward feared she would undo all his Protestant reforms. So, with the encouragement of Northumberland, he named his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as heir. When Edward died on 6 July 1553, Lady Jane was proclaimed queen. But she reigned for only 9 days before Mary gathered support and took the throne. Jane was later executed, but his death also unleashed a crisis. In the years to follow, his sisters, Mary Wine and Elizabeth Warrant, would fight to define the religious future of England. Edward VI's reign lasted only 6 years, but in that time, the boy king transformed England's religion and identity. His short life was marked by intelligence, faith, and frailty. And though he never lived to become a strong, adult ruler, Edward's Protestant vision shaped the England that came after him. The name Bloody Mary brings two very different images to mind. One is of a queen, Mary I of England, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, remembered for burning Protestants at the stake. The other is a terrifying legend, a ghostly figure who appears in mirrors if her name is chanted 3 times. But how did the real Mary Tudor become mixed up with this haunting story? Let's uncover both the history and the myth of Bloody Mary. Mary was born in 1516, the only surviving child of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. She grew up intelligent and deeply religious, devoted to the Catholic faith. But her childhood turned tragic when Henry divorced Catherine to marry Anne Boleyn. Mary was declared illegitimate, stripped of her title, and separated from her mother. When she finally became queen in 1553, she was determined to restore England to the Catholic Church. Why Bloody Mary? During her 5-year reign, Mary ordered the execution of around 280 Protestants, burning them at the stake for refusing to convert. These included bishops, priests, and ordinary men and women. The fires lit across England gave her the nickname Bloody Mary. Mary also married Philip II of Spain, a Catholic king, but the marriage was unpopular and produced no heir. Twice, Mary believed she was pregnant, but both times it was a false hope, likely symptoms of tumors or illness. She died in 1558, childless and heartbroken, and was buried in Westminster Abbey. The legend of Bloody Mary. But how did Queen Mary's bloody reputation transform into the mirror legend we know today? The folklore of Bloody Mary began centuries later. Some say it is Mary Tudor herself. Others believe it's a mix of different stories. Mary, Queen of Scots, or even witch tales passed down in Europe. The mirror game. The most famous version goes like this. You stand in a dark room, holding a candle. You face a mirror. You chant, Bloody Mary 3 times. And then, her ghostly figure is said to appear. Some say she appears covered in blood, screaming. Others claim she shows you visions of your future. But in many stories, she drags you into the mirror forever. This chilling ritual became a popular sleepover dare for children in the 20th century, spreading across America and beyond. The connection between history and legend. Why was Mary I tied to this legend? Historians suggest it's because of her reputation for bloodshed, burning Protestants alive. The image of a woman covered in blood made her the perfect figure for a ghost story. Over time, folklore twisted her real story into something darker and more supernatural. Today, many people know the ghost of Bloody Mary, but not the real queen behind the name. In life, Mary Tudor was a tragic queen, determined to restore her faith, but remembered as Bloody Mary for the fires she lit. In legend, she became something more, a ghost who haunts mirrors, a spirit summoned with her name. 2 Marys, one real and one imagined, forever bound by the chilling title of Bloody Mary. Elizabeth, I was the daughter of a disgraced queen and a ruthless king. She grew up in fear, survived betrayal, and rose against the odds to become one of the greatest rulers in history. For 45 years, she ruled England alone, never marrying, never bowing to a man. Some say she was carrying out her mother Anne Boleyn's revenge. Others say she hated men, scarred by her father's cruelty. This is the full story of Elizabeth Romers, the Virgin Queen. Early life, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth was born in 1533, the daughter of King Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Her birth was a disappointment. Henry wanted a son. Still, Anne adored her daughter, and for a time, Elizabeth was the apple of her father's eye. But in 1536, when Elizabeth was just 2 years old, everything changed. Anne Boleyn was accused of adultery and treason and executed at the Tower of London. Elizabeth was declared illegitimate and stripped of her title. She grew up knowing her mother had died by her father's hand. This left deep scars. Elizabeth grew cautious, watchful, and mistrustful of men who held power over women. Childhood and survival. Elizabeth was highly educated, fluent in Latin, French, Italian, and Greek. She studied history, philosophy, and theology. But her childhood was also dangerous. She lived through the reign of her Protestant brother Edward VI, followed by her Catholic sister Mary. for Mary saw Elizabeth as a threat. At one point, Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London, the very place her mother had been executed. She only narrowly escaped death. It was during these years of fear that Elizabeth learned the art of survival: silence, caution, and patience. Elizabeth and Elizabeth never married. She had suitors from across Europe, princes, kings, and noblemen. But she always kept them at arm's length. Some believed she hated men, scarred by the memory of her father who had executed her mother and discarded wives like pawns. Others thought it was strategy. By staying single, she kept her independence and used marriage negotiations as weapons of diplomacy. She called herself married to England. Many also whispered about her close friendships, especially with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. But Elizabeth never allowed herself to be tied down. Her refusal to marry earned her the name the Virgin Queen. Anne Boleyn's revenge. Elizabeth's rule. Some say Elizabeth's reign was her mother Anne Boleyn's revenge. Henry VIII killed Anne to get rid of her and hopefully find a son. Instead, Anne's daughter became queen, the greatest Tudor of all. Elizabeth ruled with intelligence, strength, and charisma. She knew how to play the part of both woman and king, saying famously, "Though I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, I have the heart and stomach of a king. And of a king, of England too." The Spanish Armada. Elizabeth's greatest test came in 1588, when Philip II of Spain sent the mighty Spanish Armada to invade England. Elizabeth rallied her troops at Tilbury, dressed in armor, declaring she would die among her people if needed. The Armada was defeated by English fireships, skilled sailors, and violent storms. It was a turning point that established England as a rising naval power. The Golden Age. Elizabeth's reign became known as the Elizabethan Age, a golden era of art, culture, and exploration. William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe transformed English theater. Francis Drake circled the globe. Walter Raleigh explored the New World. Under Elizabeth, England began to dream of empire. The end of the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth ruled for 45 years. But in her later years, she grew lonely. She watched friends and advisors die, including Robert Dudley. She called herself a woman left alone. In 1603, Elizabeth died at the age of 69. With no children, the Tudor dynasty ended. The crown passed to her cousin, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. Elizabeth's legacy. Elizabeth turned her mother's disgrace into triumph. The daughter of an executed queen became England's greatest monarch. She never married, never bowed to a man, and ruled with her own strength. She left behind a legacy of victory, culture, and national pride. In her, some see Anne Boleyn's revenge, proof that the woman Henry VIII tried to erase gave him his most powerful heir. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, survived betrayal, prison, and fear to become one of the most legendary rulers in history. Her reign was her revenge, her triumph, and her gift to England. She may have been born a daughter unwanted, but she died a queen unmatched. And so ends the story of the Tudors. From Henry VII, who claimed the crown at Bosworth Field, to Henry VIII, who tore England away from Rome in his desperate search for a son, to Edward VI, the boy king who ruled too briefly, to Mary VIII, remembered as Bloody Mary, consumed by faith and fire, and finally to Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, who rose from disgrace to glory and gave England its golden age. The Tudor dynasty lasted just over a century, but in that short time it changed England forever, shaping its religion, its politics, its culture, and its future as a world power. The Tudors may be gone, but their legacy lives on in every history book, every legend, and every story we tell today. This was the story of the Tudors,